Good morning, Granite State woodturners. My name is Jon Siegel, and today I'm going to do a demonstration on spindle turning. Today's date is noteworthy. It's 2/22/22. And this video will be shown for the Granite State woodturners in March of 22, which is next month. I'm one of the founders of the Guild of New Hampshire Woodworkers, and I'm currently the president of the Guild. We have over 700 members now. The Granite State Woodturners is the largest subgroup in the Guild and was founded shortly after the Guild was founded in 1990. Like many people, I was introduced to wood turning in shop class in school. I was 14 then, and now I'm 74. So that means that I've been turning wood for 60 years. I hope I've learned something in that time, and I hope that I can effectively share some of that with you. I'm going to show you which tools and skills that you need for spindle turning. So without further ado, let's get started. Many of the members of the Granite State Woodturners have been making bowls for a while, and they have their bowl gouges and they have their scrapers, and they're interested in getting into spindle turning a little bit more. And I'm going to answer some questions about what are the chisels that you need that you may not have if you're making the transition now from bowl turning to spindle turning. And then I'm going to talk about the skills, the specific skills that you need to practice to develop your spindle turning skills. So I'm going to show you an outline of what we're doing today. So the first is the chisels that you need for spindle turning. And of course you could stop the video here and look at this and copy it down. But there are 5 chisels that you must have for spindle turning, and they're listed here. I'm going to show you each one of those chisels and what they do. And then a couple of optional ones that you might want to add to your collection. And then after we've discussed that, we will look at this. So these are specific exercises of particular shapes that make up your repertoire in spindle turning design. And when you learn which chisels to use to create these different shapes, how to use those chisels, then you can combine them together and pretty much turn anything. So my talk today is going to focus on the types of skills that you need to do furniture work, architectural work, really any kind of detailed spindle turning. As we discuss different wood turning chisels, I want to start out by talking about some basic principles of how chisels cut. Now, if you've used chisels, maybe cabinet chisels, maybe you've made mortises, maybe you've done some wood carving, maybe you have carving chisels like this. But if you've worked with chisels at all, there's one thing I'm sure you know, and that is that when you lay the chisel on the wood, you first lay it with the bevel being the ground part. You lay the bevel on the wood, so I'm moving this back and forth. Well, nothing's happening because just the bevel's touching the wood. But as I gradually raise the handle, all of a sudden the edge engages. So when you get the right angle, you find that the chisel is very controlled because it's sliding on the bevel. So I can make these cuts by scooping like that. So it's clear that if I want the chisel to go in deeper, I raise the handle. If I want it to go shallower or come out of the cut, I push the handle down. So it's the movement of the handle that controls the chisel. It's kind of like a boat going through the water. You know, it's the blunt end that directs the pointed end in the right direction. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Now, you wouldn't want to carve wood by doing this, would you? Well, you can actually cut wood that way. You can actually remove wood. But there's one thing that I want you to observe, and that is, I'm going to get the flashlight here so you can see. So when you're cutting with a chisel, you get a very smooth finish. But when you're scraping like this, you get a really terrible finish. Now, you may notice that in this demonstration, I'm working across the grain. Now, you say, well, gee, why are you going across the grain? Because in spindle turning, you're cutting across the grain 100% of the time. And that's why in spindle turning, we don't use scrapers. A scraper is a very poor tool going across the grain, even though it works very well going with the grain. Here I have some illustrations of this. So these sample blocks, on this one, the grain's going this way. On this one, the grain's going that way. Here, the grain, same thing, vertical grain and cross grain. And when you look at these, what you'll see is that the finish that you get going across the grain is very poor. But when you're cutting, the difference in the finish is hardly any. This is why we don't use scrapers in spindle turning. So in today's demonstration, you will not see any scrapers. I do all of my work with cutting tools, gouges, and skew chisels. Although it's very easy to understand why you don't want to do this, right? I think a lot of people who understand this principle somehow think, the mistake would be to think that if I take the chisel and now put it on a tool rest, that this principle now goes out the window, but it doesn't. Just because the chisel is on a tool rest does not mean that these principles don't apply anymore. So I'm going to go through the 5 basic chisels, and let's look at that list again, just quickly. And I'm going to show you each one of these chisels and talk about the shape of the tool, and then give a demonstration of what that tool does, right? So the first chisel is the rough and gouge. Now, I'm going to come over here now. All right, so the rough and gouge is just shaped like a U. It should be very circular, kind of like half of a pipe. And one thing about a rough and gouge, when you hold it up this way and look at it, you'll see that it has just a rectangular profile. That is, it doesn't have a nose. It's ground straight across. And also, the corners are sharp right angles. Many people, when they sharpen these, they roll the chisel around too much, and then these corners get rounded. And that's definitely a mistake. The corners should be right angles, and the end of this should be straight across. Now, these come in different sizes. Most catalogs have these in 2 different sizes, 3/4 inch, which is what this is, and a 1 1/4. I don't think you need the 1 1/4 unless you're roughing out pine porch posts and large work like that. For normal furniture work, especially in figured wood, the smaller version is the best size. So let's see what the rough and gouge does and how it works. Now, when you're practicing spindle turning, and you're really just starting out, learning different skills, and you know you're going to make mistakes and things are going to go wrong, I think it's very important that you find some practice wood that you have nothing invested in. You don't have either time or money invested in it. It's wood for you to learn with. It's wood for you to turn and not be afraid that you're going to make a mistake. If you have an expensive piece of wood or something you've glued up in segments and you have a lot invested in it, you're going to be so worried about making a mistake that you'll be so overly cautious that you will not really learn. You need to learn what works and what doesn't work. And you need to make mistakes and say, oh, I see that went wrong because I did this wrong. So you need to start with wood that's free. And where do you find wood that's free? In the firewood pile. And, you know, this is New Hampshire. It shouldn't be too hard to find a round piece of wood in the firewood pile. Or you can find a maple sapling that's about this size that you can cut down and get a lot of really nice pieces. So this is a maple. This was growing in my backyard a few days ago, and now it's here. And we're going to use this to demonstrate different chisels and what they do. So often people say, well, wait a minute, how do you center this? You know, like, say, well, I know how to center a square. I draw an X on the end, but how do you center this? Well, first of all, remember that this isn't even exactly round, right? So it doesn't really have a center. You know, a center refers to something that's round. Don't worry about centering it. Just get it as close as you can. I'm just going to stick it on here where I think it's going to work. And then, you know, give it a little spin and see if you might make a little adjustment in that, like here. All right. And this is a little bit high right there, so I'm going to move this over a little bit right there. Okay. And that's good enough. Okay. And remember, when you start up the lathe, make sure the tool rest, you know, being that this is irregular, you don't want to move this up close and then start the lathe because there's a bump there that's going to hit. Start out back here, get the lathe going, and then bring the tool rest up and you can see what you're doing. So for a piece like this that's not very round, there's a lot of roughing out to do. Well, we're going to take the roughing gouge, and as you bring the chisel up to the work, first of all, make sure your chisel's on the tool rest. And then as you bring it up, make sure the handle is down. And the first part of the chisel that touches the work is not the edge. The first part of the chisel that touches the work is this part right here, the heel. And with the handle down, you'll find that the heel will touch, but there's no cutting going on. So now we're right back to where we were over with a piece of pine on the bench, is that we're going to raise the handle until the edge engages. And right there, as soon as you see chips coming, then you know that you're at the right angle, the correct angle. And once you're at that angle, now you can proceed. Now we're going to go after this little bump here first, get rid of that bump, and now we can do some real roughing out. All right, over here. At the beginning, you have to go carefully because it's lumpy and intermittent. And as things proceed, you know, it becomes more round. Well, let's see what that looks like. I need to get over here. All right. So I have a spur center with a spring in it. So in order to stop the workpiece, I don't have to turn off the lathe. I just back off the tailstock one turn. The spring pushes the work away from the spurs, and there it is. So okay, we still have some bark here, and there, and here. I just wanted you to see that. Start up again. Well, how do you know when you're done? Well, you can kind of hear it and you can kind of feel it, but you can also touch it and you can feel that there's a little bit of flat spot right there. You can't see it, but you can definitely feel it, and there it is. Okay. this is your most important product. When you're practicing wood turning, for goodness sake, don't try to make anything. What you want to make is this. This represents that muscle memory and that learning process. This is what you're after, is to again, to learn what works and what doesn't. If I want to learn more about how to use the rough and gouge, maybe I should just take this piece of wood and turn it into a toothpick. And then whatever toothpick is left, I throw it in the wood stove. Let's just try that. Let's just see what a rough and gouge will do. All right? I'm going to stop here and show you something. Let me get some of these chips. So if you take this chip and look at it, you notice that the grain goes across. Let me just break it right here. Now, I don't know how close you can get, but you see the shape of that chip. It's very flat and very wide. And it gets that way because if you look at the workpiece, you'll see that the width of each chip is about a quarter to 3/8 of an inch. And you achieve that by going in shallow, but using a very rapid feed. Now, what is feed? Feed is how far the tool advances per revolution. And in this case, the feed is about a quarter of an inch, and the chip is about a quarter of an inch wide. Now, what's important about this chip is that the grain is going this way. And what this represents is the optimal roughing chip because it has the least amount of end grain, right? Because it's a shallow chip that has a lot of width. So you're cutting the minimum amount of end grain to remove the maximum amount of volume. And that's why to use a rough and gouge efficiently, you want to go with a shallow cut and use a rapid feed. Let's just keep doing that. We have a lot of this wood. It's free. An interesting thing about the rough and gouge is that you're not concerned about the finish generally. You're concerned about getting off as much wood as quickly as you can, because roughing is simply a process that precedes other processes of refinement. I'm kind of avoiding this area because there's a knot there. But you can also get a really good finish from a rough and gouge simply by reducing the feed. Not a super smooth finish, but you can get a very good finish with a rough and gouge if you go slow.
Turn the gouge facing me.
Oh, you mean do it this way? Let's see, there is a knot right there. That's a little bit of a challenge. There it is. With a very sharp chisel, you should be able to get through those knots as long as you don't try to feed too fast. Let's see what that looks like. So there's that knot, and it's on both sides. But that's very smooth. There's no tear out around that knot because the chisel's very sharp. Now, you can do more than just cut straight with a rough and gouge. I mean, obviously you can go in and make shapes with a rough and gouge. The problem is, the reason the rough and gouge is not ideal for this kind of a shape is because it's square across. It really can't handle entering at very much of an angle without losing control. So I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes with a spindle gouge. But let's just say that that is what a roughing gouge does. And again, this is the 3/4 inch size, which I think is definitely the most useful for hardwood, for furniture size work, and especially for figured wood. Okay, firewood. So we're going to take another piece of wood now, since we kind of used that one up, and rough this out very quickly so we can keep going and show you the other chisels and what they do. This wood has a little bit of a hole right in the center, so we're just going to use that for the center and not argue with it. This is very not round, so it's going to take a minute to rough it out, but wait a minute.
John, is there a certain preferred height for the tool rest?
Good question.
And distance the tool rest to the wood?
Well, that question always gets asked, and I always quote Frank Payne. Do you know Frank Payne? He wrote this wonderful book called The Practical Woodturner. It was made from a compilation of his magazine articles from the 1950s. He was Englishman, Frank Payne, P-A-I-N. The Practical Woodturner. I think you can still get copies of that book. There's so many great things in that book. That book really opened my eyes about cutting and scraping and so forth. And he says, quote, "It doesn't matter what height your tool rest is. It only matters that you bring the tool up to the work at the correct angle." And so what that means is that if the tool rest is lower, your tool angle will be here. And if the tool rest is higher, your chisel angle will be here. So it's correct as long as the bevel is rubbing, right? But he also says that most wood turners don't work on top of the work enough. So what he's saying is get the tool rest up a little bit so your cutting action is more on top. You can see what you're doing better when you're working more on top. And the chisel is more horizontal rather than down here. But having said that, remember that if you're turning a very large workpiece, that the little bit of up and down adjustment that you have on your tool rest isn't going to have very much effect, because essentially you're working right at the front of the piece, right? But here we're talking mostly about, let's say, furniture turning, which is a 1 3/4 up to 2 inch diameter. That's the size that most furniture parts are. And in that case, a little motion up and down of the tool rest can have a fairly large effect on your tool angle. But remember, as you're starting to work and you're starting to get down to smaller diameters, then that tool angle keeps changing. So it's always somewhat of a compromise. But you'll notice that my chisel, this work is 2 inches in diameter, and I'm about, I don't know, 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch above center. And that's pretty much where I like to be. Because then my tool is in a natural position. It's not like this, and I'm not up like that. I'm pretty much in a horizontal where I hit the wood. And this is with my 40 degree grind, which I use 40 degree is pretty much what I use on all my chisels. You know, a Skew chisel is ground on both sides, so you have 20 and 20, that adds up to 40. And my gouges are all about 40 degrees. So here you gotta be very careful about the tool rest so we don't hit. All right, I'm gonna rough this out as quickly as I can here. So you notice here that I don't hold a gouge like this or like this. I hold it with my thumb like this, and then with my hand, I'm deflecting the chips away from my face. So keep the hand open so the chips don't build up underneath, but they're allowed to fall down like that. Another thing I learned from Frank Payne. Well, people say, well, wait a minute. If you got your hand over that, how can you see what you're doing? Well, you don't need to see the point of the chisel. What you need to see is the profile of the work up here, and then you can see what you're doing. So your hand covers the tip of the chisel, deflects the chips, but it doesn't cover up the profile up here, which is what you need to see. All right, let's get this roughing out done. And again, go very cautiously at the beginning because the cut's intermittent. I can also just let the chips go. I don't mind if the chips hit my face. I'm kind of used to that. So how do I know if I'm done? I'm gonna feel it. It's better to use your thumb trailing than use your fingers that could get caught. Well, here's another trick. This wood's a little bit wet, and so there's a little bit of wetness on here, and it's kind of sticky. So this is paraffin. Rather than paste wax, I think paraffin is a much better lubricant because it's so much more handy than trying to scoop paste wax out of a can. All right, that's feeling like it's done. Let me just take one more pass. Now we're ready to do some exercises, and I'm going to show you the different chisels. Oh, there's a little bit of bark left there. I guess we could ignore that. So on the list, let's look at the list one more time. Okay. So the rough and gouge, we've talked about it, and I've shown you what it does. And next, number 2 and number 3 are both spindle gouges. Now, the spindle gouges are normally sold in 4 different sizes. There's a 1/4 inch, which is smaller. And I guess there's the larger 5/8 or 3/4 inch ones. The only 2 that you need, I think, are these 2 middle sizes. So here's the 1/2 inch spindle gouge. Let me get all this stuff off here. That's the 1/2 inch spindle gouge. These are the conventional gouges that are ground from a round bar. And this is a 3/8. So these are the 2 sizes that you need of spindle gouges. I don't like the 1/4 inch ones. I think they're kind of flimsy. And they bend, not very steady. I have a 5/16 that I use. Those are hard to find, but they do make them. Okay. So those are the 2 spindle gouges, and I'm going to show you how to use those in a minute. And then there's a skew chisel. Now, there's a lot to say about skew chisels. I'll tell you what, why don't we put off the discussion of the skew chisel for a few minutes, and I'm going to talk just about spindle gouges for a little while, and we'll come back to this. I guess you'll notice that 2 things about my skew chisel, 3 things. One is that it's very small. 2 is that it's ground at much more angle than most people. And 3 is that the edge is a straight line and not curved. So those are 3 things that you may notice about my skew chisel. Of course, they can be ground many different ways, and I have others that are ground different ways. But if I only had one skew chisel, it would be ground this way. So then, of course, there's the thing that I call the necessary evil, and that's a parting tool. There are many kinds of parting tools. This is what's called a diamond pattern or American pattern parting tool. And I guess if you can get a shot of the end, I don't know. You see how it's beveled back on both sides so that it's a little wider right on the center line and narrower. This allows it to go into deep grooves without binding. This is a kind of an old-fashioned type of parting tool. In the middle of the 20th century, all parting tools were made this way. And this is the kind of tool that I like. And those are the 5 chisels that I'm going to use. So what I'm going to do now is start on this list. All right. So these are the 5 exercises. Now you notice that roughing out is not one of the exercises. Because I think when you start roughing out, if you have a good roughing gouge and you've sharpened it correctly, I think that you will learn how to use it. Just, you can see what I did with it. It's pretty foolproof. Don't try to do any complex shapes with a roughing gouge. It's just not good for that. You'll get in trouble. It'll catch and do things. Just use the roughing gouge for roughing. It is what its name implies. Oh, and by the way, never use a roughing gouge of this type on bowl turning. It's just too big. It takes too big of a bite, and bad things will happen. This is just for spindle turning. So these are 5. If you wanted to learn how to play a violin, you would have to go home and play scales and play your etudes, and you'd have to do that over and over again, and then you will learn the skills that you need. Then you can combine all those things together to play music. This is what we're doing here. If you learn these 5 skills, you'll be able to make just about any shape. So let's start at the top with what's called the ball shape. This is also, I guess, what you'd call making beads. So you've got your piece of wood from the firewood pile. You've got it roughed out. And now we're going to start making some actual shapes. So we're going to start right at the end. That's the easiest thing to do, is just start at the end. And what I'm going to try to do here is just round this over. And I just keep doing that. So here I'm using the 1/2-inch spindle gouge. Now, as far as doing exercises like this, I know that on camera you can't see how smooth that is, but it's pretty smooth. In some books, they say, oh, if you want to learn how to make beads, you take your piece of wood, you make a pencil line here and here and here and here, and then you form 5 beads, and that's how you practice. And that's a really stupid way to practice, because now you've made 5 beads and you've used up that whole piece of wood. What I'm showing you here is a way to practice where you'll get 100 or 200 practice strokes out of, or maybe 300, out of a single piece of wood. Because you're practicing that same motion over and over. You're taking about a 32nd of an inch each time you do that. So you have 100 practice strokes and you've only taken up 3 inches of wood. So you could get hundreds of practice strokes doing it that way. So, and then as you make your shape, you get down to this small diameter. And this is going to become the core. And resist the temptation of going deeper each time. Pay attention to that. It's very easy to kind of forget, and as you're completing the curve, you end up going a little more, and eventually that core will get so thin that you're going to have workpiece vibration problems. And you really don't need that. You have enough problems just learning these basic things from the beginning. So the rule of thumb is that the core should be about half the diameter of what you start with. This is a rule of thumb that applies to almost all decorative turnings. You know, you might be making parts for tables. And if you look at parts like this, what you'll notice is that the small diameter is generally about half of the full diameter. Okay, and we are back. When you practice every one of these shapes that you're going to practice, you need to practice on the right and the left. When you're working on the left, it's important that you're not going to run into the spur center. So what you need to do before you can practice on the left is make some room over here so that you're a little bit away from the spur center and you're sure that you're not going to crash into it. So I'm just making room. Okay, and now I'm prepared to do my practice strokes both right and left. So let's see how it looks on this side. It's really the same process. Okay, and there's your core. Let's see if we can get that a little bit smaller. Okay. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the particulars of how this is done. I should also mention that you might want to start out with a smaller gouge when you do this, because a smaller gouge takes a narrower chip, so it imparts less force, and it's a little bit easier to control. But it might be harder to get a good finish with a smaller gouge. So let's just see how that works. Okay. So when you start out, the important thing is to, I didn't really do that so well. Listen, I want to get a really nice smooth transition there, like that. Because you don't really want to see a line here where the cut started. So this is what's called a sliding entry. A sliding entry means that you start with the bevel rubbing, right? See what's happening there? Bevel rubbing. And again, you're raising the handle slightly until it starts to cut, and that's how you begin. So you're sliding into the cut with the bevel rubbing. I'm inclining the chisel a little bit in the direction that I'm traveling, and the handle is not straight out. The handle is over about 10 degrees, and that's important so that the bevel is rubbing right behind the cut, and you don't want the bevel to be rubbing right where the chisel's cutting, or otherwise it can fall in, it can plunge in. So with the bevel, so here I'm rotated to about 1 o'clock, and the chisel is about 10 degrees from, this would be 0, I'm 10 degrees over. And this is how you begin a sliding entry. And as you come in, you're coming in gradually, and now I'm rotating the chisel more and more to the right. So now I'm at 2 o'clock, and right about here, I'm about halfway down. And when you get about halfway down, something else has to happen. Rotating the chisel is not going to cause it to create the curve that you want. When you get about halfway down, you need to start to swing the handle to the right. So watch how that happens. I'm going to go right back in where it was. And now I'm swinging the handle to the right as I'm continuing to rotate the chisel. So when you end, the chisel's at 3 o'clock. Right? So you started with the chisel at 12:30 or 1 o'clock, and you end with it all the way over on its side. And now when you swing the handle, you can either keep it against your rib cage, or you can move your hand away from your torso. So whether or not your right hand should be braced against your torso or not, it really depends on the type of chisel and the type of cut. Sometimes it's very useful to steady your right hand against your body. And that's what I'm doing here. So my feet are far enough apart that I can move my body as I come around this curve, and that way my right hand is always touching my ribs. It gives me a little more steadiness. Let me go at this again. Sliding entry, coming around the curve. I'm halfway down. I start to swing the handle to the right as I continue to rotate. So essentially what I have here is a quarter round. I'm going from 0 to 90 degrees. And the chisel rotates from kind of straight up to 3 o'clock as it goes around. The handle swings to the side as it goes down. And also, since we're going into a smaller diameter, there's also a raising of the handle. All right? So the rotating and the swinging and the raising of the handle all have to happen simultaneously. If you do all those three things in a smooth motion, what results is an absolutely smooth finish and a perfectly smooth curve. All right. Thanks for coming. Okay. And sorry. We'll see you later. Now, on the left side, you know, the process is the same, but I do want to say that on the left side, it's harder for a right-handed person to do this. Well, why? Well, not everyone's right-handed. So if you're left-handed, then it's the opposite of what I'm saying. But when you're on this side, as you bring the chisel around, you're pulling it closer and closer against your body, and eventually the handle of the chisel, let me just talk about this. As you swing the handle around, eventually the handle runs into your body. And what are you going to do about that? Well, some people stand back here and pass the chisel in front of their body and end up in this position. I always find that's kind of awkward. Some people cut these handles off so that they're short enough that they can just do that without this hitting. But what I prefer to do is to move my body out of the way as I come around. So I'm starting out with my head right in line with the cut so I can really see where I'm starting and get things going. And then again, it's about halfway down the curve where you need to start swinging the handle. So in anticipation of that, I always start with my left foot way over here. So this might seem odd to be starting out like this. But when I get about halfway down, I shift my weight onto my left. My left foot is already positioned in a place where I'm holding my weight when I get to my final position, which is over here, right? So starting here and ending here. Now, when you get over here, now your point of view is no longer in the plane of the cutting circle. So it's hard. What is a cutting circle? Well, a cutting circle is what happens where the cutting is occurring. So on a lathe, when the tool touches the work, it cuts in a circle. So, okay. So as soon as the chisel touches the work, bang, there's a cutting circle. So remember that a circle lies in a plane. So the plane of the cutting circle is right here. And generally you want your nose to be on the cutting circle, so you're visualizing the curves in the exact profile. Now in this situation, you can't do that. Once you're over here, you're out of the line, you're out of the plane of the cutting circle. That makes it also a little bit harder to visualize the curve. But let's just see now with my left foot in the correct place, and I'm starting here. And now I'm swinging the handle and moving my body out of the way. And of course, I'm rotating the chisel so that it ends up at 9 o'clock. I have a little problem right there. I'm going to fix it. All right, now from the top. So now my head's over here. I'm looking at it from an angle. But it's, you don't have to see it in profile. This is your ending position right here. All right, so that's the ball shape. And you don't want to just go in and make a bead and a bead and a bead. What you want to do is just practice. I'm going to go back to the 1/2 inch, and I'm going to see how this works. I don't know which is better. I guess it kind of depends on the hardness of the material. Or if you feel that the 3/8 is easier to control, then practice with the 3/8. But see, the repetition is what it's all about. Repetition and muscle memory is what it's all about. I think in an ideal world, if I was a strict teacher, I would say, do it this way. Make one cut from the left. Make one cut from the right. Make one cut from the left. And so the reason that that's more disciplined is that you're having to reset each time. So you're resetting your angle, you're resetting your brain, and it's more challenging than just doing it on one end repeatedly, the same thing. But I think to begin with, just do one end. All right. So number 2 on the list. Let's look at the list again. Number 2 is a shape called a bottle. A bottle is a kind of a complex form. It's actually a reverse curve or an S curve. But the reason the bottle is the second exercise, the reason the bottle follows the ball is because they both begin the same way. They both begin with a sliding entry. And let me show you how the bottle works. So I need to convert the ball into a bottle. That'll take a few strokes, and then you'll see what's going to happen here. So with the bottle, you begin the same way, right? But you can get about halfway down, and you're going to reverse it. Now you can see why that's called a bottle. So this is the second exercise. I'm going to do it on the left side also. Back to the right. And so what happens here is we're starting out just like the ball, right? Sliding entry, rotating the chisel, swinging the handle a little bit to the right, and then you get about halfway down, and instead of continuing to swing to the right, you reverse the process, and you start to pull the handle back toward you. And you're also reversing the rotation, and you're starting to rotate the chisel back up. So now here I am halfway down, and I'm going to reverse the process. You see how the handle's coming this way now. Here, now watch it again from the top. That's a little lumpy. And then on this side. Get down, and now it reverses, and the handle is moving to the right. You see, I like to keep this handle touching my body. I'm not hitting the mic with this, though. That's not a problem? Okay. That's the bottle shape. Again, try not to get that too small, or else you'll have workpiece vibration problems, which you don't need. Let's see how that would work with the small gouge, just to see if it's different. It's really not different. Might be a little easier to control, but harder to get a smooth line. Okay, and there's the bottle. So with the bottle now, we've now learned two different shapes. We've been able to do a convex form, like a bead, and a concave form. And we've just merged the convex with the concave in a smooth S-curve or reverse curve. The reverse curve is really important, although it's very important in furniture work, but it's not of classical origin. Although the OG, which is the Roman classical form, was used in moldings, it was not used in columns. All of the classical turning shapes that we use in the Western world were all really derived from ancient columns. That's where it all started. And I suggest you look at classic columns and study those. You'll learn a lot from that. So, the list. What's next? Number 3, the Cove. Now the Cove is a concave shape, and since we've already done the bottle, we already have a clue about how concave shapes are made. But there's something new to learn here when we make a Cove. And what we didn't do here is that we didn't start at the top. We kind of blended a ball into a Cove. But what we need to learn here is how to begin a Cove at the top as a sharp line. So let's see how that's going to work. And I'm just going to show you how we do that. I'm going to pierce in here and scoop it out. This is not a sliding entry. This is a piercing entry. And when I say it's piercing, what I mean is that the edge is slicing into the wood. It's entering, oh, you don't want that. It's entering with the edge tangent to the cutting circle. Enter with the edge tangent to the cutting circle. There's a heavy cut. And then scoop it out. Now, let me just do this side. We'll get this going, and then I'll talk about some of the specifics about how to make the slicing entry. And see how different that is. Let me just switch. It's definitely easier to slice with a smaller chisel. All right, because the smaller chisel just pierces easier. And you see how this is the opposite of the ball. In other words, when you're making a Cove, the chisel is starting, here the chisel is starting at 9 o'clock and ending straight up, which is exactly the opposite of what you do with a ball. Let's go to this side. Try and get it. So always remember that the chisel is going to enter along this line. The chisel doesn't enter this way. The chisel enters this way because it's the bevel that guides the tool. So if you want your entry angle to be about 10 degrees over like that, you need to hold the chisel at that angle as you begin. Notice the position of the handle, about 30 degrees over, right? And the bevel's 40 degrees, that gives us that 10 degrees here. And let's start out, always get the chisel vertical. And here again, if your tool rest is higher, you're going to touch more at the bottom. You might need to raise the handle a little more to get the start of the cut. And always try to get about a 32nd of an inch to begin. And once you're in about that far, then you have nothing to worry about, and you can just scoop it right out. At the beginning, go slowly, make sure the chisel is engaged and cutting, and once it has something to bear against, then everything's fine. Now, you bolt turners will recognize this. This is really the same thing that you do on the inside of a bowl. When you're starting at the rim of a bowl and you're trying to get that gouge to begin and not get a catch and not get thrown. Let me just show you a trick. So, you know, if the edge is not exactly straight, it's going to run, you know, either to the left or to the right. And what I want it to do is I want to err on the safe side. That means if it's going to run, I want it to run to the right. So I would overcorrect and rotate the chisel more. So this past vertical. And then if it starts and if it won't catch, it's because I need to straighten up a little bit and I'll find that angle. Right, so here's my starting position. I'm going to start with it rolled over a lot, and that way I'm sure I can get in. And if it catches, it'll run off to the right into the open air and not run off to the left and spoil that finished part. There's the start. All right, and let's do it on this side again. Rotating right around. And then you end up with a chisel, you know, more or less straight up. It could still be inclined to the left as you go down. Okay, and then try to keep that core diameter. And obviously the smoothness of this is irrelevant. Claude, follow me over to the blackboard. I want to show something about this. So what we're making here is a cove, right? And a cove looks like that. And there's the cutting circle of that edge and the circle of that edge. Now, the point I want to make is that as this curve comes around, this angle here, right? That angle is not 0. It's usually 10 to 20 degrees. I don't think it should ever be more than 20 degrees. So every curve has a place where it begins and a place where it ends. And these are called the end points of the curve. And this angle, so of course you could measure this if you extend that line up and you extend a line tangent, okay, you have that angle. So this is the angle of the tangent at the end point. It's called the end point angle. And the end point angle should be, I don't know, let's just say 15. It should be 10 to 20. It should not be more than 20 in hardly any situation. Let's think of this also like you're making a bead, right? And it's the same thing with a bead, is that the tangent at this point is not 0. So the tangent line looks like this, right? And then this tangent line looks like this. And so this angle here, right, is about 10 to 15, 10 or 15 degrees. Now, it doesn't have to be always exactly, but I think where a lot of people lose good definition in their designs is that they make the endpoint angles too great. So, you know, the sharp, this is not a 90 degree, right? This is 105, let's say, right? But the sharpness of this is very important to the definition of the line that's part of the design of the turning. And the same thing here with the bead, right? So those angles are not, the reason they're not 0 is that they never look right if they're 0, because it's just too much shadow in there, and they're just gonna end up being just too deep, and they end up being flat at the bottom, and that's not what you want. You want that nice parabolic shape, right, with that endpoint angle at about 15 degrees. So this applies to coves and beads. Now we're back at the lathe. And so what I'm saying then is that there's the endpoint angle. There's the endpoint angle, you see. It's over about 10 or 15 degrees. Same thing over here. That's the angle. And once again, you know, to achieve that angle, right? So if I want this to go in at that angle, and I put the bevel against there, now you can see the angle that the chisel has to be as you begin the cut in order to get the endpoint angle to be what you want, like 10 or 15 degrees. All right. I guess, well, let me just do a little quick demonstration, a little bit more about coves. A little bit more about coves. I'm gonna just smooth this out a little bit more. A little bit out. The versatility of the spindle gouge. So in real life, when you're making a cove, you generally have to make a cove between two lines. So, you know, there's two things that you need to make a cove. And one are the lines that describe its boundary, and the second would be the diameter that you want the cove to be at the bottom. And you would set that diameter on the calipers. So let's just say it's that. Okay. And now when you begin, the first thing you need to do is try to get as much of that material out as you can and not take too long. So what we're going to do is just make some sliding entries at an angle like that. So this is the roughing process. So notice that the point of the chisel goes in, and even though the chisel's angled a little bit, it's not likely to catch because you're only exposing the point of the chisel to the wood, and it goes in like that. And then over here, the same thing, it just goes in like that. Now you got this lump in the middle, and you can just get that out. And there you go. Now you've got the thing kind of roughed out very quickly. Now, with the sliding entry, there's a limit to the angle that you can enter, and it's about 45 degrees. So what you'll see here is that I don't try to get this to go sharper than 45 degrees on either side, right? Using this type of an entry. Because the chisel becomes unstable, and it will catch, and it'll throw like that, and it'll tear out some material here from, I'm assuming that's a finished surface, and that's finished, that I can't afford to go over that line. So from this point, I'm going to complete the cove using the piercing entry method. So first thing is, be aware of your endpoint angle, though you can start out maybe a little bit less and increase it as you go. I'm going to be aware of the stability of the chisel as it enters and start making cuts like this. And I'm just sneaking up on that line by taking a 32nd of an inch at a time. Now I'm going to go on this side just to keep things, whoa, I'm a little jumpy. Keep things like that. And now sneak up on the line. Okay, now we're very close to the line, and we're very close to the endpoint angle that we want. So let me just get one more cut over here. And don't worry too much about the bottom at this point. It might be a good idea to see if you're close. All right, so now for the final, I want to get the final cuts on the sides. That means I want to hit the line, and I want to hit the correct endpoint angle on each side. And then I can go ahead and finish up the bottom. All right, so starting out here, notice the chisel's way over to the side so that I get the endpoint angle I want. And it looks to me like I need another little bite if I'm going to split that line. And just go down that far. You don't have to worry about the bottom yet. Now I'm going to do the same thing over here. Okay, and now the final thing, I like to go to the bigger gouge here. So going back and forth between the 1/2 inch and the 3/8, it's a good thing to kind of get a feel for both of these gouges and what they do best. But I think when you're making the initial piercing entry, the smaller gouge is probably better. It does it more easily. But for rounding out the bottom, the bigger gouge is better. Give me a smoother line more easily. So all I'm doing here is getting down to my caliper size, trying to maintain a smooth line and go a little deeper. And keep trying. There it is. Okay. So once you've hit that, and then you should set that about a 1/16 oversize, so you have room to go back and just fix any little lumps and bumps, and then hit the bottom. Get that. All right. So what I've tried to do for you there is the next, a real life situation of making a cove, and how you go about that. But initially, what you need to do is just make these practice cuts repeatedly, left, right, left, right. But I wanted you to see what making a cove is all about in a real world situation. So now we've come to number 4, which is a V shape. So a gouge is a super versatile tool. I've often said that if I were stuck on a desert island with a lathe and only one chisel, it would be this chisel. It would be this 1/2 inch spindle gouge, because it's so versatile. As we noticed when we made the bottle cut, it does convex forms, it does concave forms, it does sliding entries, and it does piercing entries. And it does a lot. But there's one thing that a gouge won't do, and that's make a sharp inside corner, especially a narrow corner like the bottom of a V. And for that, you need the skew chisel. Because the skew chisel cuts with its point, and it will go right down into the bottom of a V and make a clean cut. A gouge, because the edge on the gouge is a curve, as a compound curve, right? It's curved this way and it's curved that way. It just won't go right to the bottom of a V like this tool. So I'm going to start out talking about skew chisels in general, because especially someone who's new to spindle turning, they have so many questions about the skew chisel, and they've heard from other turners that it's a difficult tool to learn. Yeah, you can get catches with a skew chisel, but you can get catches with a gouge or any chisel. When you get a catch with a skew chisel, it usually does more damage because the point is so deadly that it tends to penetrate deeper and wreck more things. But in so many books, there are pages and pages devoted to learning how to do this, which is the planing of a cylindrical surface. And so many beginners have spent so much time trying to learn how to do this. But I don't think that's a particularly useful thing. In fact, I don't think you need to learn how to do that. There are much easier ways to do that. And one way is what you saw me doing a little while ago, which is this shear cutting with a spindle gouge. Now, the reason that that's better is because it's so much easier. So this is what's called a pull cut or a drag cut. And what that simply means is that the handle is ahead of the edge, and I'm pulling the tool toward me. I'm not pushing it in like this. Of course, when you're making a ball shape or a cove, you're pushing it. But here I'm doing a shear cut by pulling the chisel toward me. And the reason that this is better than using a skew chisel is because because the handle is ahead of the chisel, if something goes wrong, it just pushes this away. And it's very hard to get in trouble doing this. It's extremely stable. This is the pull cut or the drag cut. That is so much easier, better, and smarter way to make a smooth cylindrical surface or a slightly tapered surface or a curved surface. It's so much easier than trying to do this. And especially on figured wood like curly maple, you don't want to expose a broad, you don't want to take a broad cut, you want to take a very narrow cut. The gouge works so much better, especially also on long, thin work. So remember that a skew chisel by its nature produces a very wide chip because it's just a flat blade. And the wide chip produces more force, that makes more cutting force that induces vibration. So where workpiece vibration is a problem, or where curly grain is a problem, then the gouge is a much better tool than a skew chisel. So if you're not using the skew chisel to make your long, straightish cuts, then what is it for? It's for this, right? Right? From the top. This is what a skew chisel is for. And in my book, this is the only thing that a skew chisel is for. Right? Notice again, I'm just taking a 32nd of an inch, just like I was with the gouge. With all of these exercises, you're taking about a 32nd of an inch. Right? Do it on this side. I don't know if Claude's going to get the camera over here very well, but... What's important is that you can actually take a lot of wood off this way if you feed very rapidly. But if you do the same thing and feed very slowly like this, you can get a really, really excellent finish on here. And I know that you can't feel this, but you get a very good finish that way with a very slow feed. So when you get to the very last cut, that's what you feed very slowly. Remember how I said I don't think you need to learn how to do this, but actually what you do need to learn how to do is to make an inside corner. So essentially I am doing this thing that I said was useless, but I'm only doing this to clean up that corner. So you see with this tool, I can just clean up that corner. So how deep do I have to go? Well, I have to go a little deeper here. Now you understand why you need to make the down cut before you make the cross cut. Because the down cut is what severs the grains right in here. So when you meet that with the skew chisel, a little bit of lumpy wood there, you get the clean inside corner. So the skew chisel is absolutely essential to making the clean inside corners. Right? So we get sharp outside corners, we get clean inside corners, and that's what makes a nice wood turning. Now I'm going to show you with the skew chisel one other thing. So often in turnings, you need to have a sharp bottom V, like between two beads and various other shapes. And so I'm going to show you how to make a V cut with the skew chisel. So let's just start in some arbitrary place. So, because usually you'd have a pencil line, you know, where this is going to, where your V cut is going to be. So you start on that pencil line, and get some of this stuff off. When you begin, the very first cut that you make, you have the chisel straight up. So I actually can feel that being straight up. And the first cut is just a quick jab. Now you don't want to go very deep because there's really nowhere for the chips to go. And it's very easy to overheat this sensitive, especially on dry wood, overheat this sensitive point. So once you've made that first jab, and now we're going to make our V a little bit wider. We're cutting from the right, and we meet that. And now we're cutting from the left, and we meet the first one. And again, from the right, and then from the left. And then from the right. Okay. Now, if you've ever cut down a tree with an axe, you know exactly what I'm doing. And then there's always a little something to clean up at the bottom. Bingo, maybe twice. All right. And that's the sharp V. That's a really important design feature to be able to do that. Now, I'm going to show you how to execute that just by talking about the chisel. So there's 3 things that you must do in order to execute this correctly. The first thing, if I hold the chisel right in there, Claude, get straight onto this way. And what you'll see is that the V is slightly wider than the chisel. This is called wiggle room. And it's very important that you have wiggle room. If the V isn't slightly wider, and by wider I mean a slightly greater angle. If the V is not a greater angle than the chisel, then the chisel's going to bottom out and you won't be able to make progress. The idea is that each cut goes a little deeper than the one before, and that's how you get there. And in order for that to happen, you have to have that wiggle room. So that's rule number 1, is that the V is slightly wider. I would say at least, let's say 20 degrees wide. So you got 10 degrees to the right, 10 degrees to the left. That would be about right. The second point is that as you're doing this, the chisel is not held straight up and down. So to cut this surface, right, here's my 10 degrees to the left, but I'm rotating the chisel to the left, right? So to make that cut, here's 0, 10 degrees, and rotate. Now, how much do you rotate? You rotate until the edge is almost, but not quite, touching that conical surface. So you see where my fingernail is. That's that little bit of room that you need so that you don't get a catch. All right, so again, here's 0, here's 10 degrees, and here's the rotation. Then to do the right side, here's 0, here's 10 degrees, and here's the rotation. Don't rotate so much that the edge actually touches there, because you'll get in big trouble. I'm going to rotate this by hand and show you. If I rotate this too much, this is what's going to happen. And I don't want to do that under power. I just did that. So once you've got this, you rotate and you stop right there. And you don't go over too much. You don't want the edge to actually touch, but just hover right above. If your chisel is too straight up and down, what'll happen is you'll go in part of the way and it'll sort of hop out of the cut and fall to the bottom. That means you need to rotate a little more. Some people are so scared of actually getting that catch that they try to do this with the chisel straight up. It just doesn't work very well. It doesn't hug the side. When you have that chisel angle and rotation correct, once you start it, it will just follow its nose automatically, and you don't have to press it up against the side. It just follows itself because the angle is just leading it that way. So now that I've talked about it, I got out of kilter here. I don't know why. It's because I don't know why. It's because of the rotten part in the center. I think things went out. So I'm just going to true this up and continue showing you how to do this. I can make this work for us, what we're going to do here anyway. All right. All right. So watch it again. Now, you'll notice that I cut from the left and the right, the left and the right, and I follow that alternation rather closely. The reason is that usually in a design, you'll have your pencil line where that has to be. And as you go deeper, of course, as soon as you begin, your pencil line's gone. But as you go deeper and deeper, you want to not drift to the left or to the right. And the way you prevent that is to cut equally on the left and the right side. So let's try it again. There's that jab, and here's the left. Try to make equal cuts on the left and the right. A lot of people, when they do this, they end up with a kind of a lopsided bead. That's, I call right-handed syndrome, because you tend to get the chisel over a little more this way if you're right-handed, and not as much this way if you're right-handed, because you're bumping up against your body. So get your body out of the way to achieve the correct angle on this side. And notice how each time it goes deeper. And now for the last time, go very slow, and very slow. And then you usually have to just touch up the bottom like that. I'm going to show you one other thing. There is a special caliper for measuring the diameter at the bottom of a V. And let me just set it here. And what's special about it? You see how the ends are ground a special way to fit into the V. It's not really sharp, but it's almost sharp. Now, unlike regular calipers, you would never use this caliper while the work is turning, because it tends to jam in there and it'll make a nasty scratch, or could even get thrown out of your hand. So this type of caliper, you have to stop the lathe and then check it that way. All right. I didn't finish talking about this. So remember, number one is wiggle room. Number two is the rotating of the chisel. But there is number three. There is a third thing that's very important. And that is take the correct thickness of shaving. Now, all along I've said, well, the correct thickness of shaving is about a 32nd of an inch. And that depends on the hardness of the wood and so forth. So with very soft wood, you can take more. With very hard wood, you might take less. But when you bring the chisel up to initiate the cut, you can see where that point is. You move over a 32nd of an inch, and you enter right there. All right? And it's a very easy thing to see. Sometimes you'll get a little more than you want. Sometimes you'll get a little less than you want. But it's not too hard to see where you're entering. I'll just turn this on so you can see this again. So I usually come up and touch it, and then pull back and move over, and there you are. So that's how you start the cut. Now this is very important. In a moment, you'll see why that's very important about the third point. Take the correct thickness of shaving. I want to show you something else. These are the shavings from the Skew chisel. Notice that they're 100% different from these. So these are the shavings from a gouge. And these are the shavings from the Skew chisel. And if you take something like this that looks like it's something, and you just rub this in your fingers, it just falls apart into powder. Because this is 100% ingrain. It has no coherent strength, right? So basically a Skew chisel does not cut the same way as a gouge. A gouge literally scoops the material away, like an ice cream scoop. But A skew chisel is simply severing the material from the parent material. And then as the chisel enters, it kind of nudges the chip out of the way until it just falls apart because it has no integrity of its own. So it's cutting a completely different way. Okay, so now we're down to the last one. We're going to make a V cut just like we did, but this time we're going to do it into a square piece of wood. If you're making furniture, this is a very important thing to learn. This is the hardest of the beginning exercises, but I want to come back to this. I want to show you this. So this is a set of turnings. Okay. Is this all right, Claude? Can you see these? All right. Let's look at, these are kind of all one together. Let's look at this piece here. So what is this? This is a bottom rail for a table. And over here it has a notch, and on this side it has a hole. So what kind of table is this? This is a gate leg table. And then these are samples of legs, right, and stretchers for a gate leg table. Look at this. This is one piece of the table, and of course there are two of these in the table. And here we have the square part, which is sometimes called a pommel. Then you have the transition cut to the round. Then another transition cut to another pommel. Another transition cut, another one, another one, another one. So there are 6 transition cuts in this single piece of furniture. These stretchers have 2. All of the other legs have 2. Many table legs only have 1 because you have the pommel at the top, and then from that point all the way down to the floor is turned. But if you're making Windsor chairs, oh, I gotta hang this up again. Okay. If you're making Windsor chairs, you don't need to learn this. Because in the Windsor style, the pieces, there's no square part that remains in the Windsor style, whether you're making stools or chairs or tables, or because parts in the Windsor style are turned all over. But every other style of furniture, it generally requires making the cut, the transition cut, from the square to the round. And the way you do it is to make a V cut with a skew chisel, exactly the way I just showed you, except this time we're doing it into a square. So this brings us to the question of the way I usually prepare a square. I use a jointer on 2 adjacent sides, so I have 2 sides that I know are at right angles, and it's the fence on the jointer that produces that right angle. And then I use a planer to do the other 2 opposite sides. So each time I put it in the planer, I take the side that was previously jointed and that goes down. And that way I know I have 1 right angle and I have opposite sides parallel. And if you have opposite sides parallel and 1 right angle, then you have a square. So now the question is about mounting squares on the lathe. And today mostly I'm talking about chisel work, but I'd like to talk a little bit about how to mount a square on the lathe. Now, many books say that to find the center of a square, you take a ruler and you draw a line from point to point and from point to point, and that's the center square. That's a very inaccurate way to find the center of a square. I mean, for one thing, it's hard to get a ruler lined up with a point. And for one thing, okay, maybe there is no point. And so, you don't have anything to go to there. What you really want is a marking method that measures the distance from the flat sides, not to the points. And so you use a marking gauge for that. So I set the marking gauge at approximately half, right? And whatever marking gauge or type of thing you use, or V-tool, whatever you use, it's very important that you do this 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, Claude, can you get a good picture of that? So what you end up with is a little tic-tac-toe. But because, so first of all, you don't need to set the marking gauge to the exact half. You just have to be kind of close to half. And after you've done that, it's very easy to see where the center of that little square is, right? And you do that, and you're done. All right, let's do the other side. 1.
So John, why is this important?
This is important in accurate furniture work. I mean, we can go back to any of these pieces of furniture. Let me just take this other turning here. Oh, that's stuck. But, well, I don't know. Yeah, let's take this. Got a lot of stuff here.
Can you repeat the question, John?
Yeah. Why is it important to be accurate in this step of centering the work? Because where the round part meets the square part, you need this to be equal all the way around. Not just so that it looks good, but because you want this to be the maximum diameter that it can be. I mean, let's look at this end where you're going into a bead. So this is another typical, often a bead would be the first feature. But you want that bead to be as large as possible. So that means it has to be centered in the square as perfectly as possible. So in any accurate furniture work, getting the square has to be straight, and it has to be a true square and not a rhombus. And that means, you know what a rhombus is? A rhombus is a square that's twisted, meaning that it's not right angles. It has 4 equal sides that are parallel, but they're not right angles. That's what a rhombus is. So it's important that you have 90 degrees, especially if you're attaching a stretcher this way and a stretcher that way, then you need this to be exactly 90 degrees or your whole table frame will be out. It won't be 90 degrees anymore. But more importantly for the turning, especially where you have this kind of a transition where a straight part meets the square, you notice that on this turning, that step and this step and this step and this step are all exactly equal. And that results from careful centering. Okay. So this method is much, a method that measures from the sides rather than trying to make an X from the points. You're starting out with a much more accurate method. See, and I can kind of get this over a little bit. You know, wood has hard and soft layers, especially oak and ash, ring porous woods. In ring porous woods, the center tends to always want to fall into the nearest soft layer, and it can throw off, and I'll show you how to correct that. All right, so now we have a little center punch at each end. All right, so here are things that you should never do. You should never drill a hole at that point. Second thing you should never do is take the spur center out of the lathe and hammer it into the end to indent it. And the thing you should never, never, ever do is to hold this over here and hit this with a mallet to try to embed the spur center, because that'll ruin the bearings of your lathe.
I've done all those, at least once.
All right. And the reason you never do those things is because they are totally unnecessary and a total waste of time, and don't really, what they really do is they make it impossible. Oh, the fourth thing you should never make saw cuts in the end. I forgot to mention that. You know, once you've drilled a hole or made saw cuts, now you've completely lost your ability to adjust those center points. And the ability to adjust those center points, if need be, is a very important thing in achieving accuracy. So, you know, usually when I do this, I purposely make one of these off a little bit just to fix it. So I'm purposely making that one a little bit off. All right. What else? Maybe you think this is crazy, but I'm putting a wax in all this. All right, now we're going to get this on. By the way, this lathe was made in New Hampshire by the Blount Company, and they started out in Everett, Mass, and then after World War II, they moved to Milford, New Hampshire. This lathe was made in Milford, New Hampshire. And they're not in business anymore. But they made a lot of lathes and pattern makers lathes. So it's a really nice thing to have a, Claude, come around here to the left side. So underneath this guard is a regular spur center, right? So it's a really nice thing to have a spur center with a spring in the point, because you see I can get this turning, but it's not actually engaged with the spurs. This allows me to measure things and check things or whatever. And the first part of the spur center that hits the wood is the guard. And that, you see, that'll sort of synchronize, get the wood spinning. You see the guard, I guess the wood. So now the wood is spinning at the same speed as the spindle. And as I advance further now, the center point retracts and the guard retracts because they're both on springs. And now the wood is engaged and ready to turn. And you don't need any, you don't have to do anything else to get the spurs to engage in the wood. The spurs have to be all of exactly the same length, and they have to be extremely sharp as a chisel. If the spurs are extremely sharp, they will grip the wood without any previous banging or saw cutting or any of that stuff. Now let's talk a little bit about the centering. All right. So I can see that here, I'm going to get, I'll just grab something here. This will make it easier to see. Now at this end, it's running very true, and you can see that. But at this end, it's a little bit off. And of course, I purposely made it a little bit off because I want to do this demonstration. So once you've mounted the work between centers and you can see that it's off, it needs improvement. I mean, you don't just accept that and say, well, that's life, it's going to be off. No, we're going to make it on. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, you have to know where your pommel is and where your turning is. So let's say the pommel's at this end, the turning's at this end. Okay, so we'll take any kind of a pointed tool, or even an awl. And I'm just going to touch this like that. And, all right, you see it's hitting here, and it's hitting here. But it's not hitting on, it's just barely touching these. Okay, so I know that this side is high. Right. So what I need to do is move it that way. So I'll just take a mallet. Now I'm going to put tension on the center because that's important, right? And I'm going to move it. Did you see it move? And now I tighten again. So every time you move the center, it's going to go deeper, right? And you can do that really an unlimited number of times. And now I'm start up again. Bingo. Now, you know, that came out pretty close to perfect on the first try. That's because I have a lot of experience knowing how hard to hit it. Also, it varies with the kind of wood, you know. With softer wood, it moves over more easily. But making these corrections to get it right, this is important for accurate work, and you just have to take the time to do that. So let's say that this is a little table leg, maybe, I don't know, under a couch or something, little table leg. And, you know, again, we're going to talk about what is it like in real life here. So you would, I don't like that one. Let's go back to that. So this is going to be the pommel, and this is going to be the turned part. So you need a line where the pommel ends. And you do need to draw the line on more than one side because you need to be able to see that while it's turning. I mean, do you have to draw it on all four sides? No, probably not. For this demo, I am, because I want you to be able to see it. But I usually just draw it on two sides. I feel I can see it well enough. You should come back to the start. If it's a little off, doesn't matter. So everything to the right of that line is going to be turned, and everything on the left is going to stay square. And this is where you put your mortises for your stretcher or whatever. Now, one of the questions that I didn't answer, you said, how high should the tool rest be and how close should it be? Well, I talked about how high it should be, but I didn't talk at all about how close it should be. I think that many books say put the tool rest as close as possible, and that's wrong. And I think a lot of people, maybe bowl turners, think that way, because in bowl turning, it's so difficult sometimes to get the tool rest as close as you want it to be. But in spindle turning, that is rarely a problem. So you don't want the tool rest as close as possible. And now, for example, I'm holding the Skew chisel here. I want to make sure that this part of the chisel is not on the tool rest. So I need to have the tool rest back at least that far. You see, that's at least 3/8, almost a half an inch. So if the tool rest were too close, then I'd be actually resting the chisel on this sharp edge here, and that's not what you want. So by keeping the tool rest back, about 3/8 of an inch, I'm sure that the Skew chisel is going to be resting on this straight, smooth part as it enters the wood. Another thing to remember before we begin this is that a square, like a circle, is an object that lies in a plane, a planar object. And that means that it lies in a plane that's perpendicular to the axis, and when it's turning, it's still in a plane. And in order to see that line, you can't see it from where Claude is now. In order to see that line, you have to have your eyeball in that plane. So I want Claude to walk just slowly around, and as soon as you get into the plane, that pencil line suddenly just snaps right up and becomes sharp. And as you move to the side, it becomes blurry and blurry again. So this is to point out that in order to see where it is, you need your eye to be right. And I say eye. Of course, you have two eyes. But most people have a dominant eye, and that's the eye that you want. If you don't have a dominant eye, then use your nose. But you need to be in that plane. You can't stand over here and expect to see where that line is. So here we go. Now, you remember how we started the V. We made a couple of V's before. We're going to do it again. I'm going to turn this up because I want to say something important. Everything that we did over here, still applies here. Nothing has changed. But this is harder. What makes it harder? What makes it harder, well, two things, I guess. One is the obvious, is that the cut is intermittent. So that tends to vibrate the chisel if you're not absolutely steady. But the other thing that's really hard, remember point number 3. Point number 3, when I did this, and I said, it's very important to take the correct thickness of shaving. So this is the thing that's going to be harder now, because it's so hard to see exactly where the chisel is entering. And this is why it's so important to keep your eye in the plane of the square. So here we go. Start out very gently right on the line. And that's it. That's all you want to do. If something's going to go wrong, it's going to go wrong right there. Because, you don't feel very much resistance when you're doing that. And there's a tendency to want to push too hard right at the beginning because you're not feeling the wood pushing back very much. Of course the wood's not pushing back very much because there's not very much of it. But let's do that process. We've made our center, and now we're going to cut from the right, and we're going to cut from the left. And from the right. I'm just going to kind of wiggle around at the bottom there. cuts on each side. There's no law against that. Now, the thing to remember is that what I'm doing here is exactly the same thing that I was doing on the round wood. Okay, and definitely practice this on round wood first. And definitely know that the first time you do this, things will go wrong. That's why you need to practice this. Now, this is something that you can't practice on firewood unless you take your round logs and turn them into squares, which you can do. So you see the pencil line is still there. In fact, let's just for fun. Okay, so you see I've got that, see I'm right on the line because I'm ready to take my next cut from the right. So let's put me right on the line. Because you can still see the line. But then when you get to the end, the line will disappear. That's okay. When the line disappears, that's how you know you're there. Now, you may have to go deeper. Well, let me just finish it and then I'll show you. Right, here we go again. So this part is going to be all turned around. So this face right here really doesn't matter because all that's going to be taken away. The only part that really matters is this left face. So when I'm over here, I don't have to worry so much about the finish, right? Because none of that is going to matter. All right, this is what matters right now. This is the final cut. See how I'm feeling where it is? And then I move over. Right there. And then cleaning it out. Okay. All right, so see this side I roughed a little bit, but that doesn't matter. All right, so I didn't clean the bottom out perfectly. I'm going to do that just because I want it to look the way it should look. All right, so, well, what's good about this? Well, for one thing, this line is extremely crisp and there's no chipping. Of course, when it chips, it's not going to chip on this side, so as the chisel's going in, right? This part's fine. Where it's going to chip is on this side, not this side, because this is the side where the chisel's coming out of the cut. Exit. So that's where it's going to chip. So, but you notice there's no chipping of the grain here anywhere on this. That's very important. Because the sharpness and the cleanness of that line is very critical to the design and the elegance of the turning and the quality of the turning. But there's something else, is that this surface right here is extremely smooth and doesn't require any sanding, which is a good thing because you can't sand it. If you try to sand it, you're just going to wreck it. If you try to sand it, what you're going to lose is the crispness of the line, the sharpness of these corners, and the whole quality of the turning is going to go down the drain. So this surface right here, you don't sand that because you're just going to mess it up because you're trying to sand something that's intermittent. I'm going to show you one other thing here. When we were looking at this baluster, one of the things you might have noticed about this baluster is that the transitions are 90 degrees, right? So that this is a straight line and not a curved line. Here's a good one. So if you take, let me grab this. So if you take a square and you hold it against there, you see that that isn't exactly a straight line, that's square. And how do you achieve that? Well, you achieve that by making your cut not at an angle, but straight in. So let's try that. I'm just going to move over here. Oh, by the way, the black sandpaper. The black sandpaper is really useful for intermittent work like this, or making a Dutch foot, a club foot, or a cabriole foot leg. Wherever the wood's it really helps you see the profile of it. So let's try that same thing, except here we're going to try to make a 90-degree transition. So what I'm doing in here, I'm just nibbling. I've got the chisel straight up and I'm just nibbling. But this won't really get you very far, but it'll get you started anyway. Right now, Claude, I'm going to have to come over here a little bit more. So I'm coming in at a kind of a big angle here, and then on this side, I'm going for the right angle. And then you need a big angle here for your clearance. And then right here is the right angle. Let's see. Okay. Oh, we gotta go a little more. I'm on the right track though. Try to get the depth, and then, so what I'm looking at is that this plane is in the radial plane, that this plane is perpendicular to the axis. And there it is. I'm just going to get the depth, and here we go. Well, a little more. Well, see, I did break through there. Okay. One more cut. Okay. Let's see how good it is. So this should come out right to there. Very good. Maybe look at it this way. No, I guess you can. That's good. All right. So that's a little bit harder. And what's harder about that, when you're making this V at the angle, there's a certain amount of room for error in terms of the angle. You know, it's not going to change this very much. But when you're trying to make the square transition, there's not much room for error. You have to be exactly perpendicular so that that is a straight line and not a curve or bulging in the center, either way. So this shows you the versatility of the Skew chisel. I guess I want to show you, I'm going to show you one more thing very quickly since we're here with the square. Okay, now, you know, roughing out up to the pommel. Now, roughing out to a square pommel is harder, but we're going to do it anyway. I like to go in and away from the pommel. That way you're not likely to slip or go a little too far and hit that. If you hit that with your chisel, you've lost everything. Okay, so again, go in this way and go away from it. So what am I doing here? Okay, I'm guiding the chisel with my thumb, and I'm using my fingertips to monitor the workpiece so I can feel when the flats disappear, because I want to stop exactly when the flats disappear. so I have the maximum diameter to cut in my design. Right? So and I also might be dampening the workpiece vibration while I'm doing that. Of course, on this short piece, there isn't any, but this is how you dampen vibration. Use your left hand to monitor what you're doing. And as soon as the flats disappear, you can feel that. Now, do you remember when I talked about the rough and gouge? I said that when you sharpen it, it's square across and that the corners should not be rounded, they should be sharp right angles. Here's why. Because when you sharpen it that way, you can rough out right into the corner like that. And that's why you want the corners of your gouge to be sharp and not rounded, so that you can do that roughing out all with your rough and gouge in one step. And then, of course, let me grab my skew. You know, if you need that corner to be really clean, then you go at it this way. Bing, and that's it. Now that's done. All right. And now I'm going to ask Claude if we have time to do one more little project.
Sure.
Okay. I need another piece of wood. Okay. I don't know, I guess a little more there. Okay. There's a lot of roughing out on these because they're not very round. Lost my pencil. So these pencil lines represent the top of the bead, the part that I'm going to move this one over a little bit. The top of the bead, the part that I'm not going to touch. And between each one of these lines is going to be a cove with two shoulders. Okay. Smaller diameter, lower the tool rest a little. Okay. How about there? All right, and now we tight, and we're gonna rough out between each one. Feels like there's a little knot there. Right, now, as I do this, what I'm looking for is that they're all equal. Of course, I laid out these pencil lines by eye, so nothing's really equal. But I'm trying to get the spacing to be the same. There, and there, and get some depth going. Okay. And maybe a little there. And maybe a little there. And maybe a little more. I think this one, a little more here. And here. Okay, come over to the blackboard. I'm going to show you what the strategy is here. So here's what we're making, right? Down, over, up, over, and over, and over, and down. Like this, and over, and up. Okay. This is real slate, by the way. It's really a piece of stone. All right. So what we want to do now, so let's look at this. So here's where we started at this line, right? And this is what we're after. So in the roughing out process, I'm trying to get below that line. So this is just a rough process, but I need to get to a point below that line. Okay, I don't need to worry about getting all the way down there. Just get below this line, because only by getting down in there am I going to be able to create this inside corner, which is my starting point, right? So when you know, one thing I have demonstrated, but I didn't actually explain, which I forgot to explain, is that in spindle turning, you always work from the largest diameter toward the smaller diameter. And you saw that with the ball shape and the bottle and the Cove, is that you always start at the top and you work toward the bottom. And Claude, I'm walking over here because I want to pick up something, which I brought, and I forgot that I had brought this. I'm coming back to the blackboard. So if I'm sharpening a pencil with a knife, and I don't know if anybody still does this, but when you sharpen a pencil with a knife, you always go down toward the point, right? What would happen if you tried to sharpen the pencil by going up this way? Well, it would just splinter and break, and it would be terrible. It's the same thing in wood turning, because remember that a spindle turning has the grain parallel to the axis. So if you want to go down grain, you always go from the biggest diameter to the smallest diameter. So knowing which way to go in a spindle turning is elementary, it's trivial, as opposed to bowl turning, where it's sometimes difficult to know which way to go because the grain in the bowl is crossways to the axis. But the grain in a spindle turning is parallel to the axis, and so there's no question about which way to go. And that means that you're always going to go down grain, like we did in the ball, and you're always going to go down grain when you do the Cove. When you get to the bottom of the Cove, you might say, oh, I'm on a roll, I'm going to keep going and come on up the other side. No, that would not work, because you always need to be going down grain. So once I've roughed out to this, which is what I've got now, I might just try to go a little deeper. Then I'm going to always start at the top. This is where my pencil line is. This is where my pencil line is. I'm going to start with the sliding entry from the pencil line and try to establish this corner right here. Right? If I can establish these corners, then getting the Cove and everything to come out is going to be really easy. So that's the strategy of the roughing out and so forth. Now I've roughed out with the large gouge, and now I'm just going to just touch up a little bit more here and try to go a little deeper. That's looking deep enough, I think. The smaller gouge is a lot easier to get into. So you notice that this is a sliding entry, and so there's a limit to the angle that I can enter on. Okay. I don't know. I guess that's good. All right, so here we go. So let's start out now. I can do all the rights. that there may be a little bit of too much meat right there, but we'll come back to that. A little knot right there. That don't scare me. This one I didn't do. Sometimes the headstock of the lathe can be in the way. Get this a different way. Looking good. So these are the roughed out little shoulders, and they all should be about the same diameter. I mean, I'm just doing this by eye, but certainly you could take a caliper and check that those shoulders are the right height. And it depends on if you're doing an accurate duplication and you needed all the parts to look exactly the same, you would definitely measure those things. Right now I'm trying to show you technique and not worry too much, not fuss over details like that. But so often in spindle turnings, fussing over details is what will make or break you when you're trying to get 4 table legs that look alike. Now, the subject of duplication and how to get all the parts to look alike is a whole nother topic for a different day. Today's topic is spindle turning basics. So I'm just trying to show you the basic techniques that you need to know. I'm just trying to get rid of the pencil line now. Let's see, here's where I need to go way over to the side. Pretty good. Get rid of the pencil line. And there, that's looking good. What about this one? Oh, this one's all right. What about these? So you see how I just keep moving one to the other. And that's a way to get good consistency. How about this? Let's leave it open. My pencil line is there. That way. I think I need to get a little bit off of here. All right, and now the inside corners. Now, there are different chisels that, now you could, I'm going to show you 2 different things. All right, come over here, Claude, and get close to this. So, that's all finished, but what I need to do is make a clean inside corner. So I'm going to come along with the Skew chisel and just do that. So now I've kind of sliced in, and then come from the side and meet that and create a good inside corner. A little bit more. Maybe a little bit more. Boom. Okay. So if that little frill doesn't break off, that means that you need to go and make your down cut deeper. Now I'm going to show you, that worked very well with a Skew chisel. I'm going to show you my favorite chisel for doing this. This is just another kind of Skew chisel that's not skewed. It's more or less straight across, but it has a slight convexity. That makes it a lot easier to sharpen. So I'm gonna, where's my other, this. So I'm gonna point out that Skew chisels can be made out of round stock as well as rectangular stock. So this one is skewed and this one is straight across. This is my favorite one for doing little details, and I'm going to show you how it works. So I'm going to come in here and pick up the cut and go in. And now I can come in here with this, and this is just so much easier to handle because it's small. And I'm going to do that at every one of these places. Watch very carefully here how I pick up the cut. So there's the cut I made with the gouge. And so I go in and I gradually raise the handle until it starts to cut right there. And then that's the angle when I go in and do it. It's very easy to get a catch at that point if you're not holding the chisel at the right angle. Here we are on this side. There. In. And again, you understand why you have to make the down cut before you make the side cut, because you need to sever the grain. So see, starting at that, not cutting, not cutting, not cutting, not cutting. There it's cutting, boom. So as I'm moving the chisel in little circles, going down, going down, going down. And every time I do that, I move the handle a little bit more to the right until I get that perfect angle where it's cutting. And the last one is right here. There's the cut. Boom. Here we go in. All right. That's the hard part. Now, this is easy. I'm going to just make one little sliding cut there. And now, I'm going to go with my piercing entry cut. That's what that little knot is. You hear it? All right. Oops. I just touched that with my chisel, kind of messed it up. I'm not going to do more fuss. Right up here. Over here. Very good. I'll come back and fix those. That's what I get Okay, just final touch up now. There, up here, trying to get the bottom smooth. How about that? That one's a little funny. That's where the knot is. All right, let's just fix this. There she is. So again, I do this demonstration. Oh, you want me to move it around?
Yeah, the light's better.
Okay. To show you how I've done this to combine all the little skills that we were doing separately before. And the clean inside corners, the sharp outside corners, right? The ball shape, the cove, everything's combined here. And I did use the Skew chisel to make the sharp inside corners. But I don't use the Skew chisel to form the beads. I think that's the hard way. I think it's a lot easier with a gouge, doing it the way you saw me do it. And again, this is a piece of firewood. Maple. I think maple is the best wood for turning because it's very dense. It cuts really well across the grain. It's not crumbly like oak. And again, this was growing in my backyard a few days ago, and now it's here. When you cut these in the winter, they don't have as much water in them. You don't want to cut them in the spring. They're so wet, it's difficult to turn, because the chips then are so stringy that they'll wrap around the workpiece, and it's kind of annoying. So that's all. So thank you for inviting me to do this demo for you. And we're going to show this, and I'll be answering questions, and I'm looking forward to that. And we're moving forward with all these different video ways of doing presentations in light of COVID. I hope that soon COVID will be over and we'll be going back to normal. But thank you for having me, and I hope you learned something and enjoyed that demonstration. Thanks.